Welcome to tonight's work session for Monday, September 23rd on the parking utilization study. I'm going to pass it over to Acting City Manager Suzanne Woodland, who's going to give the introduction.
So, good evening, everyone. Suzanne Woodland. I'm Acting City Manager, taking Karen's place as she is at a conference this week. Before I turn over this presentation to the team, I want to take a moment to thank the Parking Utilization Advisory Group that was headed by Councilor Bagley and Planning Board Chair, I saw him, Rick Chelman. Also want to thank our community representatives on that advisory group, Mike Labrie, owner of the Labrie Group, serving really as the voice of the hospitality industry, Nicole Gagliardi, close enough, okay, from Spice and Tea Exchange, really serving as the voice of the downtown retailers. We have Steve Pesci, Director of Special Projects at UNH, Tony Coviello, market leader from McClure Engineering. We also have our city staff who spent a lot of time on this effort, and that would be Ben Fletcher, Director of Parking, Eric Eby, City Engineer for Transportation and Planning, Mike Cassad, who I saw somewhere, oh, there you are, Parking Operations Manager, Peter Rice, Fearless Leader from Public Works, Peter Britz, Director of Planning and Sustainability, Jillian Harris from his department, who's a Principal Planner, Sean Clancy, Assistant City Manager for Economic and Community Development, and Monty Bohannon, Director of Communications and Community Engagement. And so with that, thank you to everyone who put time and effort into this, along with all the public and others who participated. I'm going to turn this over to Andy Hill of Desmond Design Management. And just take it away. Let me share. Hang on.
Thank you. For the record, I'm Andy Hill from Desmond Design Management. I'm a senior associate and the project manager for this engagement. We have been partnered with SLR, who unfortunately couldn't be here this evening, and have very much enjoyed the course of our time here in Portsmouth. What I want to do this evening is to take you through a very simple agenda to give you an idea of what we've seen, what we've done, and what we are proposing back to the city here as it comes to parking. So with that said, if you can advance to the next slide. And I wanted to start off with an overall assessment on the quality and the character of the public parking system that's here in place in Portsmouth. If we can go to the next slide, please. Now, an interesting story about the image on the far right here. In the 1980s, another city council was considering the idea of introducing structured parking into downtown Portsmouth. And at the time, there was some resistance to this idea that it would change the general nature of downtown Portsmouth. In response to that, a couple of downtown merchants worked with a local graphics designer and photographer to create the image that you see at the right, which reads "Always Easy Parking in Downtown Portsmouth," as a protest against the idea of introducing structured parking downtown. As we all know, structured parking was introduced in downtown. It is the Hanover Garage now. It has, in point of fact, revitalized and supported continued growth and development in downtown Portsmouth. And while it was a sarcastic tagline in the 1980s, it has become a prophetic statement here today. Always easy parking in downtown Portsmouth. If I can steal another 1980s slogan that this immediately made me think of, it was from the Virginia Slims Corporation. "You've come a long way, baby." Go to the next slide, please. What we really were engaged to do was build on what was already a very strong foundation and a lot of momentum that was generated by an earlier series of studies done in 2012 and 2013, starting with an initial supply-demand analysis done by Nelson Nygaard, followed up by a operations analysis done by John Burke, who at one point I think was the director of parking here in Portsmouth, which was eventually consolidated into the Blue Ribbon Study, which brought forth, among other things, the parking principles that have guided the system over the last 10 plus years. And the system has done very well for itself. If you can go to the next slide, please. There are a lot of different metrics we can take a look at. The system has grown substantially in the last 12 years, almost 1,000 spaces in existence within the same study area than there were in 2012. A big part of that, of course, being the Foundry Garage. The growth has been substantial, especially on nights and weekends, as the economy has strengthened, improved, and diversified here. You've had what was a very effective pilot looking at the idea of a parking permit system in the Islington neighborhood. I know that did not go forward after the initial pilot period, but when I have been asked by other municipalities that I've consulted with how to conduct a pilot, you have been one of the examples that I've cited for, as far as building a foundation based on data, clear communication back to the public, clear statement of intent and measurement of effectiveness as you've gone through the pilot process. Probably the strongest statement that I can make about the public system here in Portsmouth is the following. The Institute of Parking, the International Parking Mobility Institute, IPMI, is like the American Medical Association for parking professionals. It is the premier trade organization for what I do. And a few years ago, they came forth with a program called the Accredited Parking Organization Designation. It is the mark of excellence among parking organizations. It is a very arduous and involved process, requiring up to a year of review, documentation, and interviews with staff and constituencies in order to establish the key performance metrics needed to qualify for the APO designation. A former client of mine and a good friend of mine with the city of Virginia Beach, one of the first municipalities to reach this designation, described the process as something between an audit and an inquisition, giving you an idea of what's involved. But it's a very lofty designation for excellence. It involves thousands of different measures of excellence here, everything from customer service to financial reporting to staff development. And I know a great deal about this because I was one of the voices that helped give rise and creation to it. There are only 45 APOs that have been issued since the program was started, and only 16 of them that have actually been given to municipalities, none here in New England. I am confident in stating today that if Portsmouth were to pursue this, I have every confidence that they would receive this designation and could be the first municipality in New England to do so. So with that said, you've grown quite a bit. You've done a great job of establishing a strong set of principles and really adhering to them, and I want to give you a couple examples of that. One of the principles stated in 2012 was the idea to invite the private sector to participate in parking as well as appropriate or as reasonable. In 2012, when the last survey was performed, there were about 8 facilities with a grand total of 176 parking facilities, parking spaces that were made available to the general public on nights and weekends here. As of 2023, there are 20 facilities that put forth almost 900 spaces available to the general public. And they are charging anywhere from $2 an hour, which is very competitive with what the city has set at the market, all the way up to $12 an hour or even above that during surge and special events as far as that goes. This might seem like a negative, but in point of fact, it's a testament to the strength of the parking system and the strength of your downtown. The fact is, investors do not get into the parking business in downtowns that are failing or struggling. They only get into the parking business in downtowns where it's a vibrant, growing economy here, and the only way that you get a vibrant and growing economy is if the public parking is supporting that growth and expansion going forward. So this is a clear indicator of how well the system is doing, that you have private sector interested in participating in it. Next slide, please. Another one of the main tenets of a premier parking organization is its ability to reinvest back into the community. Over 63% of the gross parking revenues that come in through the enterprise each year get reinvested back into non-parking operations and programs, including crossing guards, coast bus services, police details, et cetera. Overall, of the money that comes in each year, about $2.5 million gets pledged back into the general fund, and additional subsidies that go back into non-parking programs are roughly equivalent to $336 per year per median household, which would be otherwise assessed out of property taxes. So in terms of reinvesting in the community, the system's doing a great job of doing just that and meeting that best practice. So what I want to walk you through today is a general scope of the work that we've done and the general findings that we've brought forth here. It was a 4-phase body of work here. If you can go to the next slide, please. The first phase being really working with the Parking Utilization Advisory Group, or as we affectionately refer to it as the PUAG, to go forth and update the existing 2012 principles to reflect 2023 considerations. That was adopted and approved by this council, I believe, in February of 2024. From there, we moved on to an assessment of existing conditions, which not only included looking at parking supply and parking occupancy, but also ordinances and SOPs, zoning code as applied to parking, and some general benchmarking of where the system stood relative to comparable communities. And then we did a projection forward on future needs, developing models specific to the market and the city of Portsmouth, and then assessing the impact, both the absorption of existing vacant space as well as future developments that were in the pipeline, which really informed our development of potential solutions going forward. That would be the strategic plan piece that we're about halfway through right now. And we're going to walk you through some of those strategies and concepts today. Next slide, please. So what you see outlined above is the general study area. This is very similar to the area that was mapped out in the 2012 study here. There were 6,278 parking spaces within those boundaries as of May of 2023. And at the busiest period that we performed observations, we went out on a Thursday and a Saturday that happened to correspond with the first really nice week of weather that we had had, as well as Cinco de Mayo. So the feeling was pretty good capture from both perspectives here. And we counted a little bit over 5,200 cars. So there were about 1,000 spaces across the study area. We were running at around 83% utilization. Now, as a general rule of thumb within the parking industry, anything below 85 to 90% utilization is considered good and strong without necessarily having negative connotations. Where you do start to get into potentially negative connotations is when you start to run above 85% occupancy or utilization on street, and 90% or more above. And really, it comes down to a couple of different factors. One is simple perception. Studies have shown that the average individual, when they come into an area that they're unfamiliar with, if you place them in front of a parking lot that's about 90% full, as a general matter of perception, they will take a look at that, and even though there may be 10, 15 different spaces that are sitting empty there, perceptively, they're going to look at that as if it's full. Same thing if they're circling for curbside space as they go around that block. Even if that block is only running about 85% full, for all intents and purposes, they will perceive that as full. Part of this also has some very practical applications. If you have ever gone to the store to pick some groceries and you notice somebody with a brand new car who's parking and using one space for each tire so that they don't get their doors dinged here, this is a prime example of inefficient use of space, where you actually have one vehicle that should be only occupying one space that it is actually occupying four. That's an example of inefficiency of use that also can very often play into the perception or the effectiveness of supply being fuller than the number of vehicles that are actually filling it. So at 85%, you're doing very good across the study area. However, when you look at the downtown core, which really represents the vast majority of the public parking system that's in place right now, both the metered system and the off-street parking assets as well, which are only a tick over 4,100 spaces. Those were running at about 95% utilization. There were only about 204 spaces sitting empty at that busiest hour when we were out in the field back in May of 2023. So there is enough capacity there, but it's starting to get quite tight, which probably will contribute to a lot of perceptions or a lot of complaints that there is no parking, because we've, again, passed beyond that 85 to 90% threshold. By the way, that number does not account for the 121,000 square feet of space that was sitting vacant at the time that the survey was done. So we'll talk about the impact of the absorption of that space in just a moment, please. Next slide, please. One of the things that we did, in addition to just looking at existing conditions, is we also looked at the zoning code as it applies to parking and provision of parking here. We spent quite a bit of time going over that, studying it, and in point of fact, subjected it to a couple of different case studies, one of which was focused on the West End Yards. And it was our understanding that project was initially approved at the minimum parking requirements as mandated by code, and that the project came back and had to submit a second request. And so the question was put to us, does this mean that our code doesn't work? And in examining it and studying it, actually, the code works exactly as it was designed. The code stipulates a minimum requirement which is supportive of the community's goals for making sure that a project is adequately supported without impacting budding properties. It also includes a maximum allowance that allows for developers to build up to a certain threshold without deliberately overbuilding parking here, which would endanger both some of the city's sustainability goals and potentially could be used in this very hospitable market to create a reservoir of parking that might be used for commercial uses at a later date. The project did meet the initial minimum requirements. When they came back and filed for an expansion of those requirements to meet market conditions, it was below the maximum. So the code functioned exactly as it's supposed to, and we can't make any recommendations to change those essential elements. They are doing exactly what they were intended to do, and they are doing them quite efficiently. There were some language within the code that could be changed or modified to promote more sustainable practices like car share services, what people around here know mostly Zipcar, transit use, bicycle use, shared use between complementary land uses here. All of these, by the way, are authorized within the existing code that you have right now. But the pathway forward for folks interested in pursuing those could be clear as far as it goes. The best way I can describe it is I have a couple of teenage children at home, and when they come home and they ask if there's food, I will point to the refrigerator and say there's food right in there, and then they'll stand in front of it and say, where's the food? And I realize that I have to explain to them you actually need to fry the eggs and add the ham, that type of thing. You've provided a full fridge. You may just need to provide a little extra direction on how to convert that into what folks are looking for. In terms of general standard operating procedures and ordinances here, there was nothing that we saw that really leapt out to us and said, boy, this is a problem. We did note right after we had done the initial assessment that the Zone A and Zone B metering program, which existed at the time really to create some migration, if you will, from the more intensively used Zone A into Zone B, wasn't really working as it was intended. Both of them were running right up at capacity, and our recommendation at that time was that you might want to look at consolidating those. Ben and Peter didn't even wait for the report to come out and already enacted that change here. So you're getting an ROI already, and we haven't even put our pencils down yet. There is a significant amount of confusion, as we heard from multiple individuals, over what are public parking facilities versus what are private commercial parking facilities. And within our report, we're including a series of recommendations for how to differentiate that through some mandates on signage here in order to make it clearer to the average individual that while all these facilities may be using the same pay-by-cell services, they may all be using the same meter. Some of them are very clearly public facilities, some of them are very clearly private facilities, and we would just like to make that a little bit more distinct as far as it goes. With that said, the analysis was that the public parking facilities, especially in downtown, were running very high in terms of utilization, 80 to 85% on average through the course of most of the year, whereas a lot of those commercial facilities were running much lower than that. Now, part of that is, of course, a significant price differential between the two. We don't necessarily have any clear recommendations, although we do have some strategies that bear consideration for trying to balance that out a little bit and see if we couldn't make better use of some of that public supply or private supply. Of more concerning is the vast majority of the public supply that you have out there that's sitting empty right now. Remember the figure that showed 1,000 parking spaces sitting empty across the entire study area, but only 200 of those within the red zone? Well, about 525 of those are in residential neighborhoods, and they are parking spaces that have no limitation on them right now. No time limit, no meters, nothing like that. And they may not today be what we might call an attractive nuisance, but they certainly will be tomorrow. It's kind of like having a swimming pool in your backyard. If you don't put some sort of sign around it, the neighbor kids may very well fall in. So one of our recommendations going forward will be to start considering some ways that you can look at possibly imposing regulations on those streets so that they don't get flooded with people as you continue to grow in your downtown and that margin of available spaces gets thinner and thinner. Right now, as we talk about that margin of spaces getting thinner and thinner, there is no universal mechanism to communicate out to the general public as to where those available spaces are. Parking department has already started to look into some technologies and pilot some technologies. I believe they're going through a pilot right now with a company called Modi to see what can be done based on historical utilization rates as far as predictive forecasting where spaces might be available in the future. But in terms of real-time reporting, there's nothing in place right now, but it might make sense to make an investment in that going forward into the future, and we'll talk a little bit about what that might look like. The last thing to consider, and this is a general statement, you're in the same boat as most municipalities in America. Right now, the number of public charging stations relative to the number of electric vehicles requiring charging out there is a ratio of about 1 to 18 in the United States. In the next 20 years, if things don't change, that ratio is going to get closer to 1 to 40. So as we talk about looking forward and going forward, starting to put together a plan for expanding EV charging infrastructure is going to be important as well, because it took almost 20 years for the road system and the fueling system in America to catch up to automotive production when we went from horses and buggies to horseless carriages. We don't want to be chasing that same thing for 2 decades going forward. Next slide, please. So we talked a little bit about existing conditions. Now we need to talk a little bit about future conditions. And one of the things I want to make very clear up front is the difference between parking occupancy and parking demand. Parking occupancy reflects where people are actually parking. They're coming into an area. There are all sorts of land uses that are attracting those people into that area called demand generators, and they are finding places to park. And the whole idea behind parking occupancy is to report that. The whole idea behind parking demand modeling is to take it one step further and say, as we're talking about future demands coming in, where are people going to want to park going forward? This presents a slightly different picture than you get with parking occupancy, because when you talk about where people want to park, it's very often that they're going to want to, a lot of people are going to want to park on one given block because that block has been extensively developed out and is relying on the block next to it to actually get the parking supply to balance the picture. An example that I will give you in this image right here, in the middle of the red zone, you'll see one blue trapezoid. That blue trapezoid is where the Hanover Garage exists. And that blue means with all of the land uses that are on the same block that the Hanover Garage exists, it generates significantly less demand than there is supply there. It is the supply reservoir to offset the big purple donut surrounding it here, which is dense development well and above and beyond what can be supplied on an individual block. When taken together, these things balance each other out. Where you start to come into an issue is where you have multiple blocks that are running at or over capacity and very few reservoirs that are there to really set those off and balance that picture. That's when you're suddenly looking at what we like to call a supply, a classic parking problem, which is there's simply not enough supply. So when you take a look at where you are today and then you add in the 171,000 square feet of vacant space, plus almost 694,000 square feet of development that you've got in the pipeline, across the study area, you still would be okay if you look at it from a macro standpoint here. The projection is for almost 6,300 cars, but over almost 6,500 spaces, so you're still about 200 spaces to the good. You're running at 97% utilization across the entire area, but you're still to the good. If you start looking just in that red zone that makes up the downtown core with the vast majority of the public supply that you have right now, The picture is slightly different. We now only have tick over 4,200 spaces for 4,800 cars. We're running over 500 spaces in the red at that point, 113% utilization. So, as a long-winded of saying this, we probably need to start thinking about doing something about this supply issue today, because I believe in the 2012 study, the conclusion was that you were going to be looking at a shortfall that was met by the Foundry Garage, and so we now have a fairly good idea of how long it takes to bring something like that to the table. So this is something that starts to bear consideration today, planning for the future. Next slide, please. So there are a lot of different initiatives to talk about here, and I've tried to throw up some pictures of some of them for consideration. At the bottom right-hand corner here is an illustration of a system that they just put into place in Bend, Oregon. This is a system that uses cameras that are based on spatial recognition that can actually be mounted on light poles and report back to a central server as to where available spaces are or where full spaces are on a public street, and then those can actually communicate back to dynamic signage as well. So if somebody's driving along the street and they want to know where available spaces are, those signs can actually say, hey, there's 4 spaces here around the corner, or 3 spaces if you take a right here. An expansion on this type of system you can see to the right of that is in place in San Francisco. San Francisco Municipal Transportation Authority put these signs in a few years ago at key intersections. They direct folks as they are coming off of main arterials into the downtown as to where there are available spaces in their public garage network here, so that you know if you take a turn this way or turn that way, the name of the facility and the number of spaces that might be available to them. Down the right-hand side, you have a broad variety of different communities: Bar Harbor, Maine; Ithaca, New York; Telluride, Colorado, that all have one thing in common with them. In each case, much like Portsmouth, they are dense urban centers that have some geographic limitations to them. Bar Harbor is out on an island. Telluride is in the middle of a box canyon. Ithaca is in a valley between 2 different Finger Lakes here. Portsmouth is on the seacoast here. So there's some geographic challenges. There's a lot of urban density. And there's a general interest in each one of these communities toward more sustainable practices in the long term. What each one of these communities did to help support this and get past these challenges is they started to plan for and put in place intercept facilities. And intercept facilities are a little bit different from satellite parking facilities. I think Portsmouth has experience with using satellite parking facilities, especially during special events. They're the facilities that you divert folks to, and then you bring them by shuttle into downtown during those special events. Intercept facilities are actually facilities where a community has deliberately land banked and placed or acquired parcels, usually along the path of travel from a main arterial into an area, and then built a facility that may be a parking facility. In a lot of cases, they're intermodal facilities, so not only is there a parking element, but there are also places for shuttle buses or buses to come in, bicycles to be stored for micromobility as well. And really what they're there to do is to create a reservoir so that you can use the streets in a particular area, a particular district, for lots of different uses besides just vehicle deliveries and parking here. And I know that Portsmouth is already starting to move this direction. I know you just did a large expansion of the sidewalk along Congress Street to make that more pedestrian friendly here. I know that you're getting ready to launch a master planning process going forward. Starting to think in terms of where you could put intercept facilities and what role they might play in the master planning process in the future is one of the things that we want to sort of put front and center as that project starts to think about, because again, these are things that strategically have a long burn time. So with that said, if we can move on to the next slide. In terms of operational improvements that could be undertaken, we gave you a couple examples of the type of new technology that is available now to give folks real-time reports of availability and occupancy here. As we talk about growing forth and growing in the future, you've already got elements of the type of technology that these systems will use embedded in some of your lots and garages. So tying that together and being able to put that information out there would not only help you make the most of the existing parking that you've got, but also could potentially give you the ability to direct traffic as folks are coming into town to those places that have availability. Don Schaup, who is a planner, a professor, of planning from UCLA and known as the godfather of parking, wrote an article in the 1970s based on some research that found that 30% of the traffic on the street in New York was circling looking for an available curbside spot. So the ability to get folks off of those search paths and into those spaces improves CO2 emissions, it reduces congestion, and it makes for a better experience overall. Like I said, we talked a little bit, and I've already given some recommendations to the engineering group at DPW on things that bear consideration as far as changing how private parking facilities in the public domain are signed, to make that differentiation a little bit clearer, and also to make sure that as folks pull into those facilities, they know who to call or who not to call, as the case may be. You have a very strong enterprise parking fund right now, and the only thing that we're advocating as far as that goes is periodic stress testing going forward to make sure that it can not only bear the commitments that it has in place right now, but that it is prepared to bear the commitments going forward that may need to be placed on it, especially when we talk about expanding the system. Free parking is not free ever, and when you talk about expanding it, it's actually incredibly expensive. With zoning, we talked a little bit about revising some of the language to make shared parking and some other sustainable measures and initiatives a little bit more, the path for pursuing those a little clearer to potential applicants here. I know that the city has already started to investigate the idea of car share services in a little bit of Kismet. We had reached out to Zipcar about a year ago to get an understanding for what they would need in order to consider bringing car sharing services into community like Portsmouth initially, and we had talked in some general terms about that. I received an email this morning from that contact at Zipcar asking me how the process was going and when we thought Portsmouth might be interested in establishing that process. So there's still interest within the private sector to support that initiative going forward. And while your parking requirements within zoning are doing, like I said, everything they were ever designed and intended to do, periodic review of those parking requirements is always a good idea to update those to market conditions. There are a lot of communities right now that are carrying parking requirements, especially when it comes to office, that were very current in 2019 and are hopelessly out of date in the new reality of remote working here in 2024. So periodically going back, looking at those requirements, testing them against actual utilization is never a bad idea. As I said before, starting to think in terms of establishing a program, whether it's a parking permit program or something else, to create some sort of mechanisms for regulation in those 525 unregulated spaces right now is certainly warranted and worth consideration and investigation moving forward. In particular, one of the facilities that you have that's not subject to pricing right now or time limits, the Parrot Lot, is also one of the facilities that tends to consistently and persistently run at a very high level of utilization with very little availability. Again, once we start looking at something where it's running consistently over 90-95% day in and day out, that usually suggests to us that you may want to look at some sort of regulation in order to just ensure turnover and fair and equitable access to that, whether that's time limits, whether that's introducing meters or something else along those lines. Finally, one of the things that has worked very well within the public parking system has been a great success and was called for in the original parking principles and in this latest update is the downtown employee parking program. The idea of trying to find a designated place where folks who worked in the downtown knew that they could come and park at a fair and reasonable rate and find accommodation. Up until recently, the reservoir for that has been in the Foundry Garage. However, with the development that's undergoing in and around the Foundry Garage and the escalation in use there, that area is starting to get pinched as far as that goes. There will be some relief eventually when the restoration efforts in the Hanover Garage are complete and those 300 spaces are back into circulation. But as our forecasting shows, that relief will be short-lived. So finding new homes for that program and continuing that program forward should be a priority. In terms of new supply, more and more municipalities now are looking to do public-private ventures as new development comes on and are finding unique and different ways to work with private developers to introduce public parking supply into those projects here. I know that cities always had their eyes open for that. I think there may be other opportunities in the future, and so we would certainly encourage you to continue to seek those out as you go along. By the same token, as I said before, it takes about 10 years from concept to completion to get new parking built these days here. So starting the site search and starting to look at what your options are today is going to bear you fruit down the road. Much better to get after it earlier rather than later, knowing how involved that process is. And of course, even as we talk about that, we also need to think about if you do find a site, if you do decide to engage in a project, especially if it's something that displaces an existing facility, trying to find interim solutions where you can put those displaced parkers while that construction is going on is certainly advisable. You've been very fortuitous in developing the Foundry Garage when you did to allow for the restoration process that's gone on over in the Hanover Garage. Just making sure that you have a reservoir somewhere in the future, even if it's on a short-term basis, will help avoid any interruptions in service in the future. And then as we talk about going forward and looking at alternatives, our partners at SLR have done a fair amount of research and analysis on all of the different shuttle systems that are operating and bringing folks in and out and around the downtown, and they have identified some places where you could potentially, as the city, look at talking to some of these different shuttle systems and possibly brokering collaborative agreements where you could get the same level of service but not have as many circulating shuttles going forwards and backwards here. You have already started to build up a fairly elaborate bike network here, and there may be some opportunities to actually create a formal park and ride system that piggybacks off of that bike network so that folks can park in outlying facilities and bike into the city rather than bringing their bikes in and then go from there. And then we talked a little bit about the idea of starting to look for those intercept sites as well, so that 10 years down the road, 15 years down the road, depending on what the master plan comes up with, if you want to make significant changes to your downtown streetscape, you already have the reservoirs in place that will allow that to happen. So that's it in a nutshell.
Thank you, Andy.
Thank you again for the opportunity. I thank you, my team thanks you, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Do we have any questions? We're going to start with Councilor Lombardi. Sue Bagley, you're going to go last because you've gotten the most bites of the apple here so far, but Councilor Lombardi.
Thank you, Mayor. And thank you, Andy. That was very informative. I really learned a lot from that. One question I have, are there any data on the number of spaces that are occupied by workers in town? Do we know what impact that has? And if we provided a workforce parking area, how much would that relieve the problem?
There is data. I'm going to let Ben Fletcher speak to that in a minute because he's really the keeper of that. But there is a formalized program that's in place that allows the city to track how many parkers they're bringing in under that program and what that requirement might be as far as capacity goes.
So thank you, Andy, and thanks for the question. Yeah, we have about just under 500 users of the Downtown Employee Program at the Founder Garage. And during the summer months this year, we recorded our 3 highest months in a row. Over the past several years, the program's been in place since 2019. We're doing about 115 users a day at the Founder Garage.
And what about on-street? Are there any data for that?
Those folks would be paying the meter as normal and would be recorded as normal meter-paying folks. I don't imagine, given the steep discount available at Foundry, that you're seeing a lot of that. That was the point, the idea of it. I mean,
Okay, thank you.
sure.
Councilor Morrell.
I might have a few questions. I'll start with zoning.
Yes,
So there's been a lot of talk about what downtown needs for parking and what outside of downtown. Do you have any recommendations on how we could change our zoning or adjust the way we look at zoning as far as those different types of developments? I stumped him.
No, I'm trying to think how to formulate the response on this. Right now, because of the broad definition or allowances that you have within your zoning between the minimum and the maximum, you certainly could look at bringing in potentially another set of standards outside of the downtown core as far as minimums that would be closer approximating whatever market requirement or market standard is. That said, the case study on the West End Yards showed that right now, those minimum and those maximums give typical applicant the latitude to build up to the market threshold that they're looking for. If you wanted to bring those minimums up as an application outside of a particular geographic boundary here, I think you could, and I don't think there'd be anything wrong with that. By the same token, I'm going to go back to my original statement, which is the system does not appear to be broken. So this would be a modification that would certainly make common sense to the applicant, but wouldn't necessarily change overall the process you have in place right now.
Okay. Neighborhood parking programs.
Yes, ma'am.
Do you, since I'm the only counselor that lives in the pilot program.
Let's grab that third
neighborhood,
rail, shall we?
there's going to be a lot of questions as to, and we've talked about sometimes metering it through the online system and then making neighborhood residents exempt from having to pay.
Right.
Is that the simplest way, or do you have any other recommendations of how we could, at the least amount of cost, but the most effectiveness, make one work?
That's certainly one of the simplest ways. And to be very clear, most neighborhood parking programs exist primarily to exempt the people that live in that neighborhood from whatever the regulation or limitation is. So whether you're metering, whether you're just imposing time limits or anything along those lines, that's the whole idea behind the program, is to create that exemption. Best practice would say get that program in place and then start to introduce whatever the appropriate level of regulation is to hit that target turnover availability. If time limits get you there and you're maintaining a utilization of 85% or less along the curbs for most of the areas, great. That's as far as you need to go. If there's a political will and an interest in metering is probably where you're going to end up as those areas become more popular. And you may end up coming in time limits for the first year or so and then finding they get more popular and you still have to go to metering. So from that standpoint, it's internal and localized politics to determine what is the best course of action as far as introducing methods in order to compel turnover and availability.
I guess then my, hopefully last question, unless I come up with any others. You had talked about a designation for Portsmouth that would be the first in New England. Could you just give us an idea of what would be the benefit of going after that? Because it certainly sounds like a lot of work, and what the cost would be involved in order to do it.
The benefit is strictly bragging rights at this point. There is no other tangible benefit other than to showcase to the rest of the country or the rest of the world how good and strong your program is. As far as the investment, it depends on how developed the program is. You already have a lot of documentation in place. There's already a lot of metrics in place. So I don't think it's as heavy a lift as some other places that are running kind of by the seat of their pants.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, given time, we'll go to Councilor Blaylock, but one question each because we got the council meeting starting in 5 minutes too.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm more looking at the 2034 future projections.
Yes.
And I understand this map is by land use. Supply and demand, I always think of price changes. That's going to change the supply and demand. Is that incorporated any price changes? Or is that, if we kept the price the same, this is the model that would happen? I just wonder if there was any-
No. I mean, that's strictly dictated by land use.
Yeah.
Price changes will certainly influence occupancy.
Yeah.
There's a school of thought that says pricing could potentially actually influence mode choice as far as that goes. And you really need to consider the environment that you're in when you start talking about that. In downtown Boston, certainly over the last 25 years, we have had the chance to see how pricing has influenced mode choice going forward, as well as the cost of gas for the folks commuting in and out. Portsmouth is a different animal. I think you're going to create only so much mode choice by changing pricing as far as that goes. So you can certainly influence where people park. I don't know that you can make a massive influence on whether people park versus arrive by other means right now.
All right, Councilor Denton.
Thank you, Your Honor. The 18 electric vehicles sold for every one public electric vehicle charging station caught my eye because that's current. So the question is actually for Director of Public Works, Peter Rice, or for Ben. Do we have an estimated projection of when the new EV chargers will actually be installed and up and running at the Bridge Street lot?
Everything's there except for the connection between Eversource and the panel. So in theory, it will be in the next week or two,
Awesome.
but it's really dependent upon Eversource's schedule at this point.
Thank you.
Councilor Cook?
Thank you, Your Honor. I just have a question on intercept facilities and shuttle service. Have you seen any creative ways that communities have found to pay for that shuttle service? Because logically, at an intercept facility, you couldn't charge the same amount for parking that you would close to downtown.
In a lot of cases, the intercept facilities, especially if if they are in the outlying areas, are free, and the public parking revenues that are collected in the downtown core actually will subsidize that shuttle service going forward. That's how it works in Telluride. In Telluride, they've actually placed a number of their surface lots out at the edge of town. And as folks come off the first traffic circle, they go into those, and then the circulator shuttle service will take them all over the rest of downtown. Telluride, by the way, also has some great shuttle tram systems here that will take people in by air, and I tried to sell Peter on the idea of doing that here over the North Mill Pond, but I haven't had a lot of traction. So.
I like it.
Councilor Tabor, then Councilor Bagley.
Councilor Cook
Okay.
asked my question. So.
Councilor Bagley.
Thanks, Your Honor. I just wanted to thank everybody in the group that worked on this for over a year and the people that came to our public sessions to give us all the valuable input. One detail that I didn't see in the presentation that I think is important for people to know is I think the city controls about 60% of the parking supply downtown, and that's rather unusual.
50%. You control 50% of all of the parking spaces in the downtown study area. In comparison, most other municipalities, if they're really lucky, control 20 to 25%. I think Nashua controls 20% of their downtown supply. Concord can claim 30%, but 10% of that actually goes to the State House. Manchester, I think it's only 25% of the total supply is actually under city control. So being able to control that amount of the supply, you also have the ability to really set the market conditions.
Thank you.
Councilor Bagley. All right, we'll open it up for public comment. If anybody would rise to say your piece. All right, seeing none, just want to thank the folks that spent the time on the committee. Andy, for your very thoughtful and in-depth presentation. Appreciate the work that went into that and the presentation tonight. Ben, for all you do for parking here. And with that, we will close and go have the city council meeting. Thank you.